Good morning. If we could move towards our seats, please. We're going to begin in just a second. Welcome to the spring semester at Holy Communion. Yay! Thank you very much. Daniel Amsler, would you hold up that attractive brochure that you have in your hand, please? So everybody needs to leave today with one of these brochures that Jane and Beth in our communications shop have so ably put together for us. This has everything you need to know about formation at Church of the Holy Communion in the spring semester of 2018. And we have a great lineup. And we are turning our attention to a focus on the commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the martyrdom of Dr. King. And we're beginning that observation today. At the beginning of Advent, we walked into a season that we called Living Expectantly, and we studied Dr. King's work as a preacher and as a prophet, looking ahead. Our first speaker in that series was Stephen Bush, the Chief Public Defender for Shelby County, and he spoke so highly of the work of Just City, a nonprofit organization that is separate from the Public Defender's Office but seeks to promote a fairer and more efficient justice system in Memphis. I'm not going to go into the details of that because we have their executive director, Josh Spickler, here with us today. Before handing over the podium to Josh, I'd just like to acknowledge and thank Lewis and Carly Lyons, who were in on this planning for MLK 50 observation and went out of their way to arrange for Josh to be with us today. Josh, you truly honor us with your time. Thank you for giving us Sunday morning, and welcome to the Forum at Holy Communion.
Thanks. This podium is not flat, so this coffee is not going to stay up. There is a shelf. Wow. So fancy. Thanks for having me. Wow, look at that. But now can you see it? That doesn't look good, does it? It's like Starbucks brand promotion. Thank you for having me. I can only imagine what Stephen Bush said about me and us, but I do note that he made it clear that we're separate. He likes to make it clear that we're separate. We've been called the propaganda arm for the Shelby County Public Defender's Office, and that's probably not a bad description. So we're all about propaganda. I confess that I yesterday was fortunate enough to give a TEDx talk here in Memphis, which is very exciting and a lot of fun. And so it was 10 minutes, and I had a clock, and I was told if I went over, there was a sniper, and so I was tempted to just do that and walk out this morning because it's right here still, 10 minutes. But I loaded up one of the big PowerPoints for you, and so the plan would be to sort of go through criminal justice in America, criminal justice in Shelby County, and give you some data, some numbers, throw a lot of numbers at you. I hope Ben can keep up. And then I have a story. I don't know if Stephen Bush did. Stephen Bush, who was here when Stephen talked? Did he tell the story of the origin of the office? Because I like to tell that story, and he stole my thunder. Oh, I'm going to have to skip that. We're going to have to skip a bunch of slides, Ben. Such a great story. If you weren't here, the quick, maybe I can give the quick version in just a minute, so cut that out. I have a story that I like to tell about a client of mine that sort of gives a narrative to some of the numbers that we'll see. And then it's always good when I'm in congregations, especially in Memphis, to have question and answer and talk about some of the issues that we're seeing in this community around crime and around public safety. It's always near the top of the list, things people want to talk about. So, and I have opinions, and Just City has positions on a lot of this. I'll update you on what we did last year at Just City, kind of what we are about, in case Stephen didn't get it quite right, and some of our goals for the upcoming year, particularly legislatively and with projects that we're working on. So, and I understand that you have to be out of here at 10:15, and I promise to do that. That looks like such a long time from now, but I know it's not. So the first slide is one that I love to start with. I started yesterday with TEDx with this slide. Ta-Nehisi Coates is a writer. He's written a couple of really great books. He writes for The Atlantic, and last year in The Atlantic he wrote this: "The hammer of criminal justice is the preferred tool of a society that has run out of ideas." And I think that just crystallizes why we need a Just City, why we have public defenders' offices like the one we have here in Shelby County, because this is true. We have thrown the criminal justice system at so many of our social problems, and it's as if it's all we know anymore. Homelessness, mental health, addiction. We get angry at people, and we pass a law. I don't know if you followed this little sort of micro part of this story, but there's been a scandal in the Shelby County schools about grading, about changing grades. And there was a brief moment where someone said, and I would expect that we're going to see a bill in Nashville this year, making that illegal. So that will now be a crime to change a grade. It's terrible. It's horrible. The things that happen should not have happened, and someone should be held accountable. But that's kind of our knee-jerk response these days is, well, let's make a law. Let's write a law, make that illegal, and make it a misdemeanor or a felony and punish someone with a cage. And we've done that now for about 40 years, and our criminal justice system is way outsized, and it's very ineffective at what it does. We'll talk some more about that in a minute. All right, here we go, Ben. You ready? Okay. 1 in 100 represents the number of people in a jail or prison in this country. We reached this number several years ago now, but we're the only country who's ever reached this number. 1 in 100 people in our country are incarcerated in a jail or a prison. Jail is where you go when you're awaiting a determination of your guilt or innocence. A prison is where you go once you're sentenced. So if you include all the people across the country who are locked up today, it's 1 in 100 of us. In 1980, that total number was 500,000. And interestingly, I looked it up yesterday for the TEDx talk. I think it's an even more compelling number. I was born in 1974. That's 43. In 1974, this population was 218,000. So between 1974 and 1980, it doubled. Between 1980 and today, it has gone to 2.3 million. So in my lifetime, it has increased tenfold. Today, there are nearly 2.2. I don't know what that number is, 2.3. That's from a few years ago, but more than 2 million people in jails and prisons in our country. And that slide shows you how that happened. Some of us like numbers, some of us like pictures. And you can see through beginning in about the 80s, when I was a kid, we began to lock people up at a rate greater than any society in history. And that continues pretty well to this day. So the United States leads the world by far. And no one's ever done it like this. Second place, not even close. Second place is Russia. We'll talk about some of these numbers. So the number behind me, I think, is 55 per 100,000. So the way we measure a lot of things in criminal justice and public safety is per 100,000. We can measure crime rate like that, violent crime rate, property crime rate per 100,000 is sort of a baseline. So this number represents the incarceration rate per 100,000 in Japan. So that's Japan's incarceration rate, 55. The next slide is Canada. It's double. So Canada's incarceration rate is 114 per 100,000. The next slide is the United States, 693 per 100,000. So as you can see, comparing ourselves to some of our more modern democracies, we're way ahead. If we can get a little closer to home, that's Tennessee's incarceration rate. So Tennessee incarcerates people at a rate that's even greater than the national average. So 848 is the state of Tennessee. There's a graph, again, for the picture people that's next. And that shows, so this slide, this is from a website, and you could keep scrolling. It includes like 70 or 80 names on this list. And it's names of states and countries around the world and their incarceration rates. So you can see on the slide behind me, there are no countries. These are all states, and there's really tiny print, but the red arrow represents Tennessee. We're in the top 10. We're in the top 10 of all entities in the world that incarcerate people. So Tennessee is in the top 10. That's Shelby County's number. It gets really depressing when you get down really close to home. So remember that the United States incarceration rate is 693, around 700. Shelby County is 2 times that. If you can break this down into zip codes, and it gets really appalling. We'll look at a slide in just a second that I think shows that. So that's incarceration in America. But it's not just incarceration, it's supervision. It's the size of this criminal justice system is more than just our jails and prisons. And the next slide is the number of people in America who are under some sort of control, not just locked in a cage, but under community supervision, probation, parole, having already left prison, or on probation in lieu of incarceration. 1 in 31 Americans is under some sort of control of the criminal justice system. We break that down to men. 1 in 18 American men are under some sort of control of the criminal justice system. 1 in 11 black people in this country are under some sort of control of the correction system. So race in America looks like this. 13% of our population is African American in the United States of America. And the federal prison population, however, is 38%. This is really nice, Ben. Actually, I'm getting used to this. I just do this. It's like the future. And I make a joke during the most serious part of the presentation. The next slide shows you where Shelby County is, because sometimes I give this talk outside of Shelby County. You know where Shelby County is. Shelby County is a minority a majority minority county. So 53% of the population in Shelby County is African American. At the jail at 201 Poplar, there are about 2,400 men down there today, and that population is 87% African American. The next slide's a picture for the picture people, making sure I take care of you guys. It's a big, big piece of the pie. 87%, fluctuates between 86, 88, 89% every year. But that's what this looks like for race. The next slide, I think, is really the most appalling one. That orange tower on the, is it on the right? Is the incarceration rate. Using that same per 100,000 number that I talked about earlier, and if you can't see that number, maybe it's 3,000 something. So 3,000. Remember, we were talking about Japan at 55, Canada at 114. The United States average is 693, 700. 3,000 if you're a black man in America. It's men on the right, women on the left. The orange is African American. So African American men are incarcerated at a rate that is just astounding, and it's a big, big problem. So that's kind of the state of things. And it actually, a lot of times the questions come here because this is an awful picture. It's an awful thing to think about. How did we get here? Why are we here? Is it working? These are the questions that folks usually have, and this is a good time to talk about that. And also, this is the part where Stephen stole my thunder and told the great story about the Public Defender's Office, but we'll jump back into that in a second. Are there questions about criminal justice in America, about this incarceration rate and this incarceration addiction that we have? There's a question in the back already. Yes, ma'am. I can tell you, I will, yeah. So the question is what does it look like for children compared to adults? And the numbers are a fraction, number one. So if there are 2,400 men in Shelby County Jail and probably something less than 200 women in the Shelby County Jail today, there are less than 100 boys in being held to answer to a charge against them. So we're talking about jail now, not prison at all. But the 2,400 men in the jail are awaiting disposition of their case. The 175, 200 women are awaiting disposition of their case. The juvenile equivalent of that at the detention center there is probably around 75 or 80 this morning. So it's a fraction. And the numbers have really changed a lot through the work of the juvenile court and the work of the Department of Justice and the work of Stephen Bush and a lot of other parts of the community. So the numbers have changed a lot in juvenile justice in Shelby County over the last few years. So I'm not confident in what they are. But from a policy perspective and from an advocacy perspective, we way overuse that system as well. So the school-to-prison pipeline is a real thing. It's a real thing in Shelby County. Shelby County Schools still suspends people at a rate that is far greater than most other school districts and in most other parts of the country. And what we know and what Stephen, I'm sure, told you is that once a child goes into that system, the chances that they go into this system are really, really high. So I don't have statistics, but it mirrors what we see in adults. So those 75 boys that are down there today, they're all black, 100%. The samples that they take of that population it's unusual for them to have a white child in custody down there. It's unusual for them to have more than a handful of girls, but it's almost exclusively black boys in that system. It mirrors this, and it's actually worse in terms of racial dynamics. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, that's a great question. The question was what do the numbers look like for people who are awaiting trial and who can't afford bail? And I'll get to this in a little bit when I talk about some of the work Just City's doing. And one of the things we do is a bail fund, and I'll talk about that. But so of those 2,400 people, something close to half are there on serious charges, charges that would involve a firearm or force or violence, as we would define it. So that's half. You've got another 20% on drug offenses with high bonds, because of serious drug offenses, large amounts of drugs. And then I would say probably 30% of those people are there on either nonviolent offenses with bonds that are too high, in my opinion, or just really low bonds they just can't make. So we ran those numbers about 2 years ago, and I feel like it was about 200 folks a month that were on a bond of $5,000 and below, and they did their entire time before they disposed of their case in the jail. So, we did that and calculated, 200 times 12 times the amount of money it costs this county to hold those people every day, to try to project the savings that a bail fund could realize for the county, not for us, but for the county. The target of a bail fund is a low-level person that we know is coming back to court that is, a nonviolent offense. And so that's about 200. So what is that, a 12th of 2,400 right now? It's a small number, but it's unacceptable in my opinion, because when you extrapolate that over the 30 years and the growth that we're seeing in our jail right now, it's a lot of money. It's a lot of money that we're spending on people who bail funds are proving, and I'm getting ahead of myself, but bail funds are proving show up. Money has nothing to do with whether someone comes back to court or not. And we and the Philippines, the only two countries in the world, use money, it's in some theory, to guarantee that someone comes back to court, to guarantee that we're not letting dangerous people out of our jails. 200, more than a tenth, less than 20% are there and absolutely don't need to be. I think, make a compelling case that probably close to half don't need to be there. Even people who are accused of violent offenses are safe risks to release in the community from what we know, the data over 30 years, evidence that we have over 30 years. Yes, sir.
How did we get to the place where we solve problems by criminalizing laws and controlling people?
There's the question. How did we get to the place where we're trying to solve these problems with the criminal justice system, is the question. It's not a satisfying answer, and it may seem a little preachy, but I'm in a church, so. Yeah, right, I know. Fear and anger and vengeance and just a failure to understand that someone is not the worst thing they've ever done, that someone is not that despicable, heinous, awful crime they may have committed. So I get it. I'm not standing here saying that people aren't capable of doing harm to us and to our loved ones and terrorizing us, frankly, because we fear that when we go to Kroger or when we go to Macy's, right? We hear these stories and it rests in our minds, and I understand that. And people should be held accountable, and there are dangerous people, and I'm sure Stephen Bush made this case too, that need to be segregated from us for a time to protect us. I get that. But I think, just like this grading scandal, far too often we think, oh, that makes me so mad. What is the thing I want to do? Oh, I want that person to be punished. And that's a viable reaction. And I think it's a viable thing for government to do, for a community, for a society to demand punishment. It's okay. But also, how can we keep that from happening again? And that's where I think we've failed. If you ask someone this question in Europe, they would, in a lot of places around the country, they would see someone who commits a crime like that, they would see that as a failing of the community. They would see it less as, we're angry at this person for not making a good decision. What created the environment, the circumstance that he or she was able to do that? And they would then spend however long it takes, 10 months, 10 years, 20 years, very rarely more than that in Europe, helping that person get back to shalom, to reconciliation with the community that he or she has violated. And we don't do that. We act out of anger and vengeance and fear. And so that has caused us to have 3 strikes and you're out, have life sentences for children who commit awful, awful acts of violence at age 15, who never see the light of day. Only place in the world that's ever done that. And I think it's just a dependence on that idea that a cage is the only thing that some people should get, and a lack of understanding that what brought that person there, and from a faith perspective, honestly, what we all are, and that is fallen and capable of really despicable things. And I'm getting a little bit into your lane, but I think that's the answer. I mean, there are plenty of projects, plenty of solutions that I'm going to share with you in a second that Just City's involved in that can provide relief to the suffering that's going on, unnecessary suffering on the nonviolent end of this. But I think ultimately we have to have an awakening at how we use our criminal justice system, and if not from a moral or faith perspective, a financial perspective. It is breaking communities like Memphis, Tennessee, and states like Tennessee. because this is one of the most expensive things government does. Lock someone up, watch them 24 hours a day, feed them, care for them, clothe them, house them is very expensive. And our budgets can't handle it much longer if we're going to continue down this road. Long answer. Very preachy. Any more questions? Ben and I are going to have to figure out which slide to go to. Just keep going, Ben. Just keep going. This is the story of the Public Defender's Office in 8 seconds. I don't know. It started in 1915. There was a awful crime up north in Dyer County. There was a young black man accused of this crime. Most of you were here. The young black man was transferred down to Memphis because there were lynch mobs who came to the jail and looked for him. He was given an attorney and tried here in Memphis, and this attorney won an acquittal for this young black man. And that man went to become a state senator and passed the law in 1917 that created the Shelby County Public Defender's Office. So that's the 10-second version of that story that I hope most of you heard from Stephen Bush. So this community has a legacy of protecting the rights of people who are charged with crimes, even the rights of young black men in 1917 who've had very, very few rights. This young black man was tried in front of a jury of all white men in 1917. And it made such an impact on this man, Sam Bates was his name, that he opened the Public Defender's Office in Shelby County, the third oldest in the country. There were only 2 others when that happened. And so it's really a remarkable story that a lot of people aren't aware of, that this community holds a place in history for protecting rights and for recognizing that there should be process in between a violent act and punishment for that act. And so, 1917, and Stephen, I'm sure, told the story of how the rest of the country caught up in about 1963 with a case called Gideon versus Wainwright. The future Supreme Court Justice Abe Fortas, who represented a young man, not so young, before the Supreme Court and guaranteed the right to a public defender for everyone in 1963 in that Supreme Court case. So, and this community already had it. So that's sort of the short version of that story. Stephen probably didn't brag on his guys, so I'll do that. At the Shelby County Public Defender's Office, about 100 attorneys these days. That slide says 80 plus. So they took over juvenile court, the defense at juvenile court about 3 or 4 years ago, and so now we have a juvenile defender unit for the first time, and that kind of inflated their numbers a little bit. So including those numbers, between 35 and 40,000 cases a year down there, and they are just, without talking about numbers, doing a remarkable job. I mean, there's an employee in the room, so he can fill in some of the details maybe, but the morale there is great. The lawyering that's going on, the advocacy that's happening in that office right now should make you proud as a taxpayer of Shelby County. Whether you always believe that some of their clients should be their clients or should have representation, the Constitution demands it, and they're getting it, in a really a better way than they ever have. So you should be very proud of the work that those guys are doing. They're constantly in contact with national folks, with other offices who want to do it better. They're recruiting really well. They're bringing in folks from law schools that are the best in the country, which is relatively new. They used to just get guys like me from the University of Memphis. I worked there as a fresh lawyer in the year 2000, so almost 18 years ago now. We'll move right into my story about Ray. So I'll skip that bar graph. You guys have been graphed to death. So I began to work there as a public defender in the year 2000, right out of the University of Memphis Law School, thanks to Stephen Bush, who said, you should come volunteer because you don't have a job. Thanks, Stephen. Stephen worked there at the time, and I did, and I fell in love with it, and I fell in love with the raw nature of it, a little bit of the shoot from the hip nature of it, going into a courtroom and going toe to toe with the prosecutor, and sort of fighting these overwhelming odds a lot of times. I fell in love with sitting across from mostly young men who had never had a professional sit down and talk to them about their needs or their problems, and some of my guys, they're big problems. So I went to work there, and I met this guy outside of that courtroom, which was my first assignment at the Public Defender's Office, Division 10 of General Sessions, which is the lower level courts where everything sort of filters in. It's a lot of misdemeanors. I think I did probably 100% misdemeanors when I first got there. So low level stuff, thefts, crimes of homelessness, the occasional DUI and assault. And I would have 20, 30 cases a day. So, and the Judge Anthony Johnson, may he rest in peace, was like most of the judges down there. 4 hours on the bench is a lot of time. So I'm representing 20 or 30 people every day, and not necessarily disposing of 20 or 30 cases every day, but touching 20 cases every day in a 4-hour span. Most of the people were like my client Ray, who I'll tell you more about in a second. Mental health issues, homelessness, addiction, those things were rampant in this population of low-level misdemeanants who had been cycling through the system for years. And so the next slide is Ray's aircraft carrier. So Ray grew up in Memphis. He went to Carver High School. He joined the Navy. He learned to weld. And he was stationed or assigned to this aircraft carrier, the USS Forrestal. And he's told me stories of seeing things, in the Mediterranean or the South Pacific, the Suez Canal, from the deck of this aircraft carrier. As a young man from Memphis, Tennessee, I can only imagine what it was like for him. But when I met him outside that courtroom, he was in his 40s. He was addicted to crack cocaine. He was practically homeless. His family had disowned him. He owed thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to various debtors, including the criminal justice system, including education. He had lost his driver's license. He was a mess. And he would show up to court because he had made his few $100 bond somehow, and he would come to court, from the community, from wherever he slept the night before. But he would be drunk, or he would be high, or he would be asleep, and I couldn't rouse him from the bench, and we would just try to get him out of there so he didn't get arrested. And so his case dragged on and on and on. It was a second offense DUI, and so that carries 45 days mandatory day for day in prison in Tennessee. So, and he was guilty. I mean, there was no defense. And so, convincing him that there wasn't much I could do for his case was difficult because he was enjoying freedom. And so his case dragged on. It was passed from lawyer to lawyer. Eventually got it. And again, representative of all the clients, most of the clients that I had at that time, so many problems, so many underlying reasons that he's there in the criminal justice system, besides the fact that he's a mean, nasty person. Right? He possessed illegal drugs. He drove drunk. He did dangerous things, and he should have been, and he was, held accountable for them. But every time he came into that system for the previous decade, he had been given very little other than a cage and some supervision. This time, because of his service in the Navy and because of a program that's now been discontinued by your General Assembly, he was able to do 28 days of that 45 days in inpatient drug and alcohol treatment. Skip that slide. Stop right there. That's good. And so he was able to do 28 days of inpatient drug and alcohol treatment. So finally, we're giving him something other than a cage. We're giving him an opportunity. Doesn't have to take it. A lot of people fail, but he had it. So I'm going to pause and step to the next part of this story. It's my favorite. This is Iron Man. This is Robert Downey Jr. He also, around the same time that I'm talking about with Ray, this is the year 2000, Robert Downey Jr. got arrested in 1999 for speeding down Sunset Boulevard in a fast car with heroin, cocaine, and a loaded .357 Magnum, just for good measure. And he is also facing the criminal justice system, like my client Ray. But he didn't come to court with a 25-year-old, know-nothing public defender. He came to court with a team of lawyers. And that team of lawyers had a plan for that judge. And it wasn't a plan to prove his innocence, because he was as guilty as Ray was, right? Probably security cameras and the 2 or 3 police officers took to stop him. So they came with a plan for how to treat his underlying needs, right? The reasons that he was speeding down Sunset Boulevard, the reasons that he continually used drugs and alcohol to excess. And the judge looked at that plan and said, yes, we will give Robert Downey Jr. probation. Robert Downey Jr. never spent a day, in a cage, well, maybe one day, or at least time for a picture. But they let him out, and he came back because addiction and mental health are very, very complex and difficult issues. And he came back again, and he came back again. And they kept giving him second chances, and he came back with that team of lawyers. And so I say that to say that this is how people of means, and Stephen Bush probably said this too, he loves to say that, and it's right. People of means come to the criminal justice system like that, and they always have. And he told you, I'm sure, I hope, about the Jericho Project, which is his version, the public defender's version of this very same thing. It's no different from what we would do were we to face the criminal justice system like that. We would come there with a plan. Here's how we're going to deal with the underlying reason that brought us to the criminal justice system. And so the Jericho Project is mirroring what Robert Downey Jr. did all those years ago, what you and I would do were we to face the criminal justice system, but what is so rare in our criminal justice system. So I'm getting away from my slides a little bit. I talked about that. I've talked about that. The revolving door for sure. Jericho Project, well, there it is. So let's finish up with Ray, I guess. The next slide is one of my favorite slides. They actually let me use this slide at TEDx yesterday. They were very strict about trademarks. They're like, don't use anything trademarked in your presentation. And I put that in there, and I'm like, make them say no. And they let me do it. So the Cadillac slide is because Ray has a Cadillac today. He drives a Cadillac around Memphis. It's his second Cadillac since he got out of prison. He's bought 2. And so Ray, because of that 28 days and that opportunity that the system gave him, some point decided, early on I suspect, to live sober, to every day wake up and decide not to use drugs and alcohol, which, as some of you probably know, is a very difficult thing to do. And he's been doing it now for 18 years. And he went to work for a major employer in town, again, because of his service, and he works there still today. He's a supervisor of 17, 18 people. He's been Employee of the Year for that organization. He owns a home now through a program that he's paid back all those tens of thousands of dollars. He paid back $10,000 for driving privileges alone. He went out to the driver's service center 3 times before he was able to pass the driver's test and buy his Cadillac. But he, he's an exception. He's the PowerPoint guy, right? He's the one that I tell because I think we need to see that it's possible. We need to see that there is potential in every single person. But I think back to the question a second ago is what can we do? What have we done? Why have we done this? Is when we think of people who come to the criminal justice system, we think of that homeless, middle-aged black man whose body was addled and riddled from addiction and from a decade of living on the streets and finding that next hit of crack cocaine. We see that and we think, I don't know. Instead of seeing that 19-year-old sailor who's standing on the deck of an aircraft carrier that he helped put together or hold together with welds, right? I mean, one of the speakers yesterday said the irreducible glory that we all have, and that's, Pollyanna maybe to some of you, but I think if we don't do that, then we're going to continue to have a system that fails all of us, but fails a certain population a lot. Because our cages are not full of people that look like you and me. They're not full of the Robert Downey Jr.'s of the world. They're full of the sickest, the most marginalized, the poorest among us. And that's not okay from my position as Josh Spickler. And I hope that it's not okay from your position as Holy Communion, and if not that, from your position as a Shelby County taxpayer, because again, this is one of the more expensive and wasteful things that we do when we don't have to. We have to provide more opportunity at low costs, like the public defenders are so good at doing, especially with something like the Jericho Project. We have to provide this opportunity for people to be redeemed, for people to prove that they are more than this terrible thing that they may have done. Sorry, that was my rousing finish, I guess. And I haven't even talked about Just City yet. It's time. We've got some time to pause maybe for some more question and answer, and then I can talk more about Just City. All right. Yes, ma'am. Right here.
How many of the judges who deal with this population are amenable to what you're talking about?
Are amenable? So how many of the judges are amenable to what I'm talking about? That's a good question, and it gets me into even, that was fraught territory that I just finished up in. This is even more fraught because these judges are elected, and this is very political. The money that we spend as a community, we do so via people that we elect, who make the decisions, who make the priorities, who set the priorities for how we spend our money. And those leaders would stand here and in some ways echo what I'm saying, that we can't arrest our way out of the problem. It's a popular thing to say. And yet our jail is fuller now than it was 10 years ago. Our jail is fuller now than it was 2 years ago. And it is because those leaders continue to act in a way that they always have. And it's not so much decisions by individual judges. It's a culture. And it's a culture that they many times grew up in, like I did, and that they participate in a lot of times without thinking, just like we do. So, not that many, because in Shelby County, the path to becoming a judge very often goes through law enforcement instead of bleeding heart liberals like me and Stephen Bush. So they're certainly not going to stand up here and say a lot of the things that I've said this morning. There are some of them who have done remarkable things to address many of these problems, things like the drug court, things like mental health court, things like veterans court, and there are programs like, what's the one called now for trafficked women? I can't think of it. But there are plenty of programs being supported by judges, and there are plenty of judges willing to give 1 and 2 and 3 chances when people have, very clear substance issues or very clear mental health issues. For instance, the Jericho Project has an amazing reputation, and most judges down there, when they get a proposal from Jericho, will say yes automatically because of the success of that program. So I don't mean to say that it's an iron-fisted group of judges. It's not. But it is a group of judges that are a product of a system that hasn't done a lot of good self-assessment, in my opinion. How was that for a dancing around answer? Yes, sir.
I would just like to make an observation that about the time that this problem started occurring, you're going to achieve what we have achieved.
I agree. I mean, I can't disagree with that. And I think the point that you make most reflects this maybe idea that I've brought to you that this is all happening in a vacuum. It's not, right? I mean, this is not the only system that we need to fix. This is not the only system that has continued to fail us, like education and so many of our social institutions that don't work like they used to. Boy, we could go into a long conversation about democracy, for instance. Of course, and we've criminalized absenteeism in schools. So I feel like a lot of times the criminal justice system is sort of the bucket at the bottom of all of this. And the parents, truancy is now a crime for the parent. So we're going to throw the parent in jail. We're going to suspend the parent's driver's license if their child doesn't go to school, or suspend the parent's driver's license if they don't pay the traffic tickets that represents half a month's rent. And so the bucket at the bottom is the criminal justice system. And I would say, again, maybe I haven't made it clear enough that I believe in personal responsibility and accountability. I did a ride-along with a police officer a few years ago now, a couple years ago. And they're the tip of the spear. They're the guys that we ask to do all of this, like all of these social antisocial behaviors or moral fabric issues that we have in our community. We are tasking with the criminal justice system, and at the very tip of that is a group of underpaid, overworked, targeted law enforcement officers. And they're carrying this even more than these judges and these public defenders and these bleeding heart advocates like me. And so I don't want it to get lost that, yes, there are systems all across our society and our culture and our cities like Memphis, which are ravaged with poverty and racial tension. But we have to begin to reconcile our criminal justice system with that and not lean on it as heavily and not depend, because it's very expensive. It doesn't work. And it just is exacerbating these problems to think that, well, that should now be a crime. That should now be a crime. It's a great point that you're making. Yes, ma'am.
I asked a question of Stephen Bush when he was here. Charges were dismissed, and they were. That's why there's 4 of them. It just keeps cycling.
Yeah. And here, yes, absolutely. And back to my original point that what we offer is a cage. And it's the thing that we always offer, or supervision, probation, whatever. But that does not fix the problem. So the Shelby County Corrections Center has a history of having actually some pretty good vocational programs. One in particular that I'm aware of is an electrician apprenticeship program that was sponsored by a major local electric company and a federal grant, I believe, or maybe a state grant. And they were producing electricians, and every single electrician they produced was hired immediately. They could not fill the need for these types of jobs in our community, and they exist across all types of vocations, but electrician was the one that I'm familiar with. And the director of the Department of Correction, was whatever resources we can give to this program to get men into it, to get women into it, to get them out of here and get a job, we're going to do it. And they did. and the grant ran out, and the program died. And this community, not for any, no one here was asked, should we continue that, should we not? It wasn't a referendum, but the community didn't step in, and that's not to blame Mayor Luttrell, that's not to blame any single person. It's to blame, again, a system that doesn't see that. It doesn't say, we've got to give something more than time spent in a cage and under supervision and a bunch of money to pay in court costs. We haven't gotten to that yet, but when those things exist and they are proven, we're not stepping in to fill that void. And so I hear you.
Something to fill that void would be something that I could support.
Yeah.
I wouldn't support decriminalizing.
Right. Yeah.
I would support mandatory, marketable training.
And I support accountability. Like, don't hear me say that cocaine shouldn't be illegal. Cocaine is very dangerous. Heroin's very dangerous. It should be illegal. Obviously, breaking into your home should be illegal, right? Robbing you at gunpoint should be illegal. Accountability should exist, and some of that accountability should include detention, because people can be dangerous. For a variety of reasons, but people can be dangerous, and detention is viable. So I sound like a flaming liberal a lot of times, but what I see is a system about 30% the size that it is, and sentences probably something like that. Then we can debate that all day long, but our sentences are incredible, especially in Tennessee. Like, we still have life sentences for kids again, and 51-year life sentences. That's the second longest life sentence in the country. So we're throwing people away. We're saying when we make that decision, you are not worth anything for the rest of your life. And now we have to house you, by the way. Those are the things I'm saying, more so than don't hold people accountable for using cocaine. Don't hold people accountable for breaking in and stealing your lawnmower. Do that, but then as a community say, how can we keep that from happening again? And how can we keep that from happening for people who haven't been caught yet or who haven't done it yet? I want to tell you just a little bit about Just City, so you'll know that I'm not just about these remarkable ideas that will never come to fruition in my lifetime. But in Just City, so the best way I decided this morning was to show you our Christmas cards. Maybe some of you got them. If not, we would love to have you on our mailing list for next year. We sent out 4 Christmas cards this year with one number on each of them. The 250, oh no, that's not the first one. They go in order. 2, so we're a part of 2 lawsuits, class action lawsuits, against the state of Tennessee for this practice of suspending driver's licenses for failure to pay. So about 5 years ago, the state of Tennessee became one of a handful of states across the country that suspends a driver's license for non-payment of any criminal court costs, whether it has to do with driving or not. It could be a misdemeanor marijuana charge, it could be a possession of a weapon charge, it could be an assault charge. And if you don't pay your costs within a certain time, they take your driver's license. And that has resulted in hundreds of thousands of suspended licenses over those 5 or 6 years, without any determination as to why you're not paying. That's the key. There's no hearing. There's no opportunity to say, here's my budget. Here's what $75 a month would do to my budget. And for a lot of people in this community, it would not be possible. So there have been lawsuits filed in a few other states. We've partnered with some national advocates to file 2 lawsuits now because of 2 sort of technically different suspension schemes against the state. And a judge in Nashville granted a temporary restraining order last year restoring 2 driver's licenses, basically agreeing that these folks who are struggling in poverty were not given an opportunity to have a determination made why they weren't paying. We will give them, the state was required to give them their licenses back. So that's not a win-win, but an indication that we are on solid constitutional footing, we're on solid legal ground here. So we're a part of that to try to change that, because that impacts so many people in this community. Obviously, the most suspensions were in Shelby County, and as you can imagine, it disproportionately affects people of color as well. $170 represents the amount that we were able to reduce the expungement fee. So expungement is something I haven't talked about, but that's at the other end of the system when people have finished their sentence. That conviction goes with you generally forever. In Tennessee, it's very difficult to get it off your record, and they decided a few years ago that if you did qualify to get it off your record, it was going to be $450, which is about 3 times the next highest fee down there. And we long ago decided that was too high. We've been raising money and spending money to pay for that for people, but we've also been trying to get it reduced so our money goes further. So we got it reduced by $170 last year. What's next? Through $250, so through our Clean Slate Fund, which pays for these expungements, we've expunged more than 250 people, dating back to my time in the public defender's office, where we started raising this money and using small grants to pay for expungements, to get people able to go back into an employer and say, I don't have a conviction. The law allows you to say, I have no conviction when you get an expungement in Tennessee, but they charge you $450, and that's at the end of paying a lot of other court costs and doing a lot of other things and waiting 5 years. So 250 times we've helped people clear that record permanently, and we have amazing stories of people who have, it catapults you into another level of employment. When you go from seasonal or temporary employment into full-time permanent employment, you get benefits. You're at home at night to do homework with your kids, like something really small that you don't think about maybe for people who are working third shift over and over and over. Like, it gets you to that next level. And so of those 250 people, our survey shows that the vast majority have improved their economic independence. And we've got one lady who sent me a picture of her standing in front of a house that she just bought that we helped 3 years ago. So, I mean, it's that kind of thing, a small thing like a clean criminal record, getting a 10-year-old theft of property from Walmart off your record finally can put you into the healthcare field in a way that you've never been able to get into. So 250 times we've done that. What's next? 300. What's 300? Oh, yeah, 300. So back to kids. So I mentioned life sentences for kids. There are nearly 300 people now in Tennessee prisons who are serving time for offenses they committed as kids. They're serving sentences of 15 years or more, some life sentences, but over 300 people. And so we're working with some national funders to survey those people, to get some of their stories. What brought them to the criminal justice system at age as young as 13? What were their lives like? And they were terrible. They were horrible, horrible existences, and it's absolutely no wonder that they ended up in a prison in Tennessee. But many of them are there for the rest of their lives. And so we're in the conversation with some advocates in Nashville about what to do about that for the future, and maybe what to do about some of these kids. Can we bring them back 20 years later and assess their 50-year sentence and make a determination that maybe we should have another go at it now that they're 45-year-old men. So 300 people in our prisons across the country, and we're helping survey them. We've got a team of researchers that we're helping through Just City go and talk to those folks. What's next? Just real quick, Clean Slate Fund we talked about. Oh, the need, like, look at this. I pulled this from our phone log just this morning. We got over 3,000 phone calls at Just City. Just in case you're wondering, there are 2 of us at Just City. 2 people to answer those calls. And you can see we didn't get to many of them. And not many people left a voicemail either, so I don't feel quite so bad. But that's the need. When you put yourself out there and say, we offer expungement help, we offer driver's license help, like, that's the tsunami that we have faced. I'm sort of really close to my time, so maybe there was 1 or 2 more questions. That's Just City, so we're working on a lot of these issues that aren't what I've been spending most of my time talking about. But yes, sir.
Several months ago, there was an article in the newspaper about the promulgating some of the problems that we have.
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's a good question. So transportation is kind of that's a system that's broken, and the public defenders did a really cool thing where a few of them rode through the bus system to get to appointments that their clients have to make all the time. And so I think maybe David Waters wrote that story, and it was remarkable, putting these public defenders putting themselves in the place of their clients and showing how hard it is in this transportation system. And so that's one. I think, as much as Mayor Strickland and I disagree on a lot of things, he's put a focus on community centers and libraries that I think are systems that need a whole lot more attention and a whole lot more work. And summer job training programs that, if you think our 3,000 phone calls are a lot, when every year the city opens its summer job program for young people, they get 3,000 people lined up down the street for, 75, or it's more than that, 300 jobs. I mean, it's, so you have to invest in systems like that, grow them, expand them, because those are a lot less expensive than building jails, a lot less expensive than police officers, a lot less expensive. And the results, what do they say? The best thing to stop a bullet is a job. And so these young men who are being victimized and who are victimizing, they have no hope. And so the systems that can provide that, transportation is one, getting around this town, having a thing to do, right? Having a library to go to, a community center to go to, works. It may sound like, Bill Clinton liberal dreams, but it works. these kids, they have to have hope, and they have to have a feeling of opportunity and need. And so things like that, I think the system of democracy or the system of legislating that we have in Tennessee is one that I'm sort of thinking a lot about lately. It's part-time. These guys pride themselves on how quickly they pass a bunch of laws every 3 months, every year. And it's not been good. It's resulted in some really expensive, broken systems. Give them a year's salary. Give them a little bit of a staff. Give them an opportunity to dive into some of these issues and learn about them instead of depending on 5 minutes with a guy like me or 5 minutes with a guy like the guy from the pharmaceutical industry or agriculture or all the many things we're asking them to do. That system is desperately in need of attention because it results in policies that make little sense, and can we blame them? They don't have time or resources to explore real good solutions, and they, anyway, that's a system. There's so many systems. Is there maybe one more? Oh, boy. Yes, ma'am.
Do you think you could find us a case that's on your expungement file? Give us some information about the person. Maybe we could develop a relationship. I think we could raise the money to.
Yes, maybe. We certainly have a wait list. Oh, sorry. The question was, can maybe I give you guys a person from our expungement wait list, and maybe you raise the money and maybe develop a relationship with the person? Yes, I think. There's some confidentiality issues there because the whole point is to kind of get past this thing, this being known as this thing. And there's also, we've sort of taken the approach at Just City that there is no further need for you to prove yourself. Back to Mayor Strickland, who also has an expungement fee fund, which is really great. They require some job training for folks, and many times these are folks who've been out of the criminal justice system for a decade, and job training is not what they need. They need $450 to get this off the record. And so we've sort of, as you can imagine, taken the approach that we don't ask questions that, not that you would, but so that's another reason that I'm often hesitant to wait for people to do things. And we can talk, absolutely, and I appreciate that, and I think that we can probably do something. Maybe the one in the collar, so I don't get in trouble. Yes, ma'am.
I want to point out that our Interfaith Thanksgiving service, all
Yes.
the money raised for
Yes.
that went to expungement. So many of you in this room have helped with that fund. Our Episcopal Service Corps helped fund an intern.
You did.
To field some of those 3 South.
You did, and shame on me for not talking about that.
No, that's great. Our Teen Read, the reason we do Teen Read is because literacy directly affects the way that people enter criminal justice. So we are doing some things, scratching the surface at Holy Communion, and if you want to do more,
Absolutely.
let's do it and talk to me and we can connect.
And I should say that offering was a significant offering, and last year, no, this is 2 years ago now, this is 2016, but was part of over $60,000 that we raised and spent to pay for expungements over the last 12 or 14 months. So yes, absolutely. And Chelsea Capus was that Episcopal Service Corps fellow who was remarkable, and it takes a lot of hours to get those 250 expungements done. And Chelsea, through the Episcopal Service Corps, was instrumental in growing our ability to do that and helping us create a system so we can take people and put them into that system, because those 3,000 phone calls resulted in fewer than 100 expungements. So you can, most people don't qualify. So we spend a lot of time in the ones that we can talk to telling them no. But Chelsea helped us with that, and yes, you are doing remarkable things. There's a lot more to be done, so we can talk afterward, and I will stand up here and talk to you for as long as you feel like skipping church.
Josh, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm gonna get in trouble for that.